A father came to put his arm around me, but he accidentally stuck it up my head and he felt the sweaty neck that I had. When I was performing Princess Jasmine at Disney, my partner, the Genie, was the life of the party, but he couldn't say a single word. Most people don't realize that as a face character, you're not just a princess. You're a full-time translator for a partner who is navigating the world through a mesh mouth hole. From dodging Meeko's accidental tail swipes to mind reading a silent genie, it's a grueling, unscripted balancing act. So when I wasn't on set performing for guests, I was usually hanging out backstage with an Aladdin friend and a fellow genie friend. And sometimes we would even get a Jafar. But one of the conversations that I remember having a lot with fur characters was whether or not it was harder or easier to be a face character. And what I remember the fur characters telling me was, oh, it's so much harder to be a face character because you guys have to always be on, like underneath our costumes, we can make whatever face we want, we can look bored, we can be angry, we can be anything. But for you guys, it's harder. You know, you have to be talking and using your voice and all of that. But I don't know, I always thought the fur characters had it way harder because I performed both. They first would train you as a fur character and then you would get trained in a face role. If by chance they really needed you, they would just bypass fur character training and you would only learn a face role. And I was very envious of those people. It was usually a Cinderella in my day, as we didn't have Queen Elsa or any of those other characters. But I personally always felt like being a face character was much more glamorous because I loved the makeup side of everything, putting on all of my false eyelashes, and everything was a joy and a treat. And I'm not gonna lie, you were definitely treated nicer as a Disney princess than you were if you were a fur character. And also with a face role, you're being judged constantly on your physical appearance, which you do have some control over to a degree, but not 100%. And I heard stories about girls going and getting plastic surgery just so they would look like a face character. And to me, that's going way too far. But usually the face characters were always eating very healthy backstage. That was something that I noticed that was different or would distinguish us from others. The face characters were eating like healthy yogurt. I was always watching to make sure that I wasn't eating too much or that my stomach would look flat on set, because at the time Princess Jasmine used to bare her stomach. And so yeah, there's just much more placed on your physical appearance when you're a face role compared to when you're a fur character. I always felt like men were better suited for the fur character roles because they could wear the heavy costumes, which would leave marks on my skin from the weight of, especially Pluto, the head, or carrying the bag around, it would leave like red marks on me. So I really liked fur characters for being down to earth, and they had more humility, in my opinion, than the face character roles. I remember in particular when Aladdin would go out of his way, because there could be some division, like the face characters hang out with the face characters and the fur characters would hang out with fur characters. But I remember specifically one of my Aladdins going out of his way to go hang out with the stinky, sweaty people because he told me, I don't want them to think I'm a snob. So he wanted to go and be with them. So I was like, you do you, boo-boo. Like, you know, it's all good. I'm gonna sit here with my book in my quiet solitude in the break room where we were. We had a big old mirror while he would go and fraternize with the fur. I also felt like the people who did fur characters had a genuine love for their job and making people happy. They had different, you know, non-conventional looks or skin conditions. Big reason I want to bring this up is because when they would put that costume on, they would receive so much love from people and no judgment for their physical appearance. Because let's be so for real, there's a Bible verse that I grew up reading. It's 1 Samuel, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord sees the heart. Okay, and so a lot of people, you know, think of little kids in the grocery store. If they see somebody with a deformity, they're gonna be like, oh, mommy, look, that person has this on their face, or they'll judge. You know, humans, we like judge people by their outward appearance. And so I thought, and what would make me happy and warm my heart is to see the joy that some of these people would get being able to wear that costume, and for a few minutes out of their life, or however long their shift was, they were not being judged for whatever physical deformity or funky appearance that they had, because people were just excited to see Baloo, or people were excited to see Goofy, and they weren't being judged by their physical. So for that, like that, I saw that and it mattered to me. I'm gonna get teary-eyed. It made a difference to me because I was like, they get to be loved too. I hope that doesn't sound bad. I mean that in the best way. So I feel like if you are somebody who feels that way about yourself and you want a job where for a little while people actually are like running to you instead of running away from you, I felt like for character people had some depth to them in a way that maybe a young 20-something might struggle with, okay? So the characters that I often worked with were Genie and Meeko when performing Pocahontas. And usually for like Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween party or Mickey's Very Merry Christmas parties, I used to get to have a Jafar. It was usually like holidays and special occasions where Disney would put out even more characters. So I don't remember specifically ever being trained to work with a fur character, but I was especially blessed to have an Aladdin because I mostly performed Princess Jasmine even more than performing Pocahontas. But that Aladdin that I worked with, can I just sing his praises? All of the Aladdins that I worked with were extremely strong in improvisational skills. That is one of the things that I will say where I felt very humbled. Like I just got to stand there and kind of look pretty in my makeup and costume while the Aladdin was hilarious and would make me laugh all day long is what I remember. Whoever, it didn't matter which one, they were all funny. But because of that quick-witted improv, they usually, and it was kind of like guy bonding because Genie was very tall, so it was usually a man in there, and he was always sparring or whatever with the Aladdin. And so I kind of felt like I didn't have to do a ton, but there were a few times at Epcot where I do remember, oh, you know what it was? The Aladdin would go home a couple hours before me at my Epcot shift. His shift just didn't last as long as mine, but that's when I would only have like 1 or 2 sets where I would work alone with Genie sometimes, and it wasn't as fun, if I'm being honest, because the Aladdin carried so much of the work for me in that regard as far as improving. But we did our best, and it was a different vibe when you are just with Princess Jasmine compared to when it's a full party of bantering, you know. What I remember is a lot of quoting lines from the movie. And so it's been 20 years now since I've done it, but one thing I do remember about Genie is he was very helpful for getting the young boys to come out from hiding behind their mom, because a lot of times little boys would get so nervous to meet me, like shaking, hiding behind their mom, and I would be standing there like, come, like trying to bring them out. But the genie could go and get them so that they weren't afraid of me, which is so weird. Like the little girls were happy to see me, little boys were, I don't know. It was just, I never made my son meet Princess Jasmine, but we also lived here in Orlando. I feel like if you're from a different part of the nation coming, you're gonna wanna get that picture, you know? So the Genie was awesome about, you know, hey, you know, kind of being cool with the kids. And they were so great at miming too. And it's like a sign language. They knew how to, you know, like fist bump with kids and things like that. And so that was really cool. So the fur characters, as far as explaining complex emotions, a lot of times it would fall on you to make up a story for them to mime to. Whatever you were talking about, the Genie could relate to it or whatever. If I was like, Genie, don't you love going through the desert? And then he would demonstrate that he was like soaring through on a magic carpet he could do all kinds of miming. Sometimes I had like a regular Genie who he knew what he was doing, and they would get so good at communicating non-verbally, whether it's pointing at images on shirts or just being funny in general. Like sometimes them just being jovial and bringing that exciting energy, that energy can be contagious, you know? I gotta share though, performing with as Pocahontas with a Meeko was not as easy for me as it was to perform with a Genie, because the Meeko was always getting into trouble. Like, for some reason, the people who perform Meekos, it was always a girl because they were tiny and petite to do Meeko, and they were crazy. They would just get into people's backpacks. They were always causing mischief, climbing things almost. Well, we weren't even supposed to climb. The trainer was having to reel them in. They were just getting wild and misbehaving, and I was like, what? Meeko, constantly having to correct a Meeko. Meeko, don't do that. Meeko, like, that's not how Pocahontas would do it. Meeko, please, it was a lot. It was like I was not a mom, and so it was like having a crazy child that was out of control that you were constantly having to reel in and make it look magical, and like you never got annoyed and you never got upset. It could get annoying sometimes though, because it was all day long versus like the guest is just experiencing it for a few minutes. Ah, that's so cute. Okay, it was cute the first time, but after, a week of all day long, it could get a little bit tiring, versus the Genie. The Genie was well behaved. He was not getting into trouble. The Genie was making us laugh. The Genie was magical. The Genie was cool. Meeko was mischievous. But you know what? Pocahontas loved Meeko, and I had to remind myself that a lot of times. So future Pocahontases, beware. Beware out there of the Meeko. Because another thing is, when I was performing Pocahontas by myself, I controlled the conversation. I controlled where this was going. I came on the shiny bird in the sky. Nobody's interrupting me. With Meeko, he was interrupting. Where are you from? Let's have a conversation. It was a much more intellectual experience with Pocahontas because she was a real person and people would get into the history of it, But if Meeko's there disrupting everything, that's causing trauma. You know what I did like performing Pocahontas was when I had Ratcliffe with me, the villain. Ratcliffe was awesome. Ratcliffe didn't take, he always had this angry scowl on his face and he didn't take nonsense. For some reason, I feel like they would swap. Like Meeko would go out for one set and then they would bring Ratcliffe out. So it would be two different performers so they weren't constantly in the heat. Like, especially in June and July, Florida heat can get really bad. And so, but this Ratcliffe was so scary to these children. He would frighten the daylights out of them. We used to have to send him away because he looked so angry and menacing. And he would walk around like very intimidating. Just, adults loved him, children not so much. But I loved him because I wasn't having to babysit him. And so that was really nice. And so because being with Meeko required me to babysit so much, I wasn't able to have these nice, intelligent conversations that I so desperately wanted to have because, it could be a lot of talking to children, and sometimes getting adults in your line could be refreshing because you're having that more deeper conversation, it's not just you talking, because sometimes kids, they don't talk, and so you're talking for them. Oh, that's a lovely shirt you're wearing. When I was Princess Jasmine, it would be a lovely shirt. With Pocahontas, I didn't focus so much on physical. It was more, what have you been doing? I would try to ask all these interesting questions. Oh, I canoed from Virginia to get here, that type of a thing. And the kids would always look at me so perplexed, like, you canoed here? How did you canoe? But even just the fact that I was getting the ball rolling, versus conversation could be interesting. And I felt like Pocahontas had more interesting conversations when Meeko wasn't messing things up. I'll never forget performing as Rafiki at Disney's Animal Kingdom. And one of the ladies who wanted to take a picture with me came up and she was like, I feel so terrible for this poor person inside this costume. They must be sweating bullets because I can barely breathe in this heat. And the husband walked over. I remember he put his arm around me and he was like, oh, don't worry about it. They've got an air conditioner in there. They're fine. They're fine. I was not fine. I did not have an air conditioner inside my costume and I was sweating bullets. So just FYI to everybody who thinks there is AC or cooling pads or any of that in the fur costumes, there is not, unless something has changed in the last 20 years. Last I checked, there was not. I had heard as I was leaving in 2009 about a fan in one of the costumes, but I think that was because the costume, like it was Baymax or something, and he actually needed a fan just to inflate himself or something like that. So it was for practical reasons, not to cool the person inside. There was another time where I was performing one of the country bears. Wendell was somebody who they would often put me as if I had to work a first shift. And I'll never forget, like, so my hat or my head would come up a little bit. A father came to put his arm around me, but he accidentally stuck it up my head, and he felt the sweaty neck that I had, and he like immediately withdrew his hand, and I remember being like, like, oh no. But that is something interesting that you may not realize, that these fur characters are working hard. Although I did appreciate Wendell, I was not left with a lot of marks. If I had to portray a character that where the head was very heavy, that could be very painful. But the best fur characters have upper body strength, and so guys especially tended to have more upper body strength than any of the Disney princesses. When fur character shifts would come around, if necessary, we always were hoping or trying to give it away to a guy who would be better suited to the role. But because of the height of certain characters, in order to get a more petite person like Mickey Mouse, oftentimes it was going to have to go to a female, because to find a guy who was shorter could be difficult. Once you get to my height and shorter, it was difficult to find males. But you couldn't be too tall for Pluto. Goofy, you were gonna have a tall person, that type of thing. As far as tips with interacting with fur characters, especially with Pluto, please, I remember performing Pluto, it was very difficult to sign sometimes, or because if you look at the hand that they use, it's like taking an oven mitt and writing your name, Pluto's name, and you would get, with practice, you improved, you would get good at it. And as much as possible, having your book open, giving them the pen and placing the pen in there, just in case, because vision can be limited, and understanding that you shouldn't touch their body in any way unless they are hugging you. Like, do a nice hug, but don't pull tails. Please do not pull tails. You can seriously injure the person inside if you are pulling on them, or just, they need to maintain their balance. And so you want to be considerate of their clavicle bone and that they are a strong person. You just don't want to be pulling. It's not good. Especially when you're wearing heavy gear on your head, you can get a lot of pain. And so it's important to just be gentle. Do, hugs, that's fine, but definitely no tail pulling. During fur character training, one of the emotions that you were told to never show is anger. You could demonstrate happiness, sadness, every emotion except anger. It was off limits. And I always remember thinking, if anybody ever pulled my tail, that it was gonna be difficult to hold back anger. I think I would have bolted to leave the set rather than show anger. I would have just been like, and I'm out. Like, your character attendant is usually your bodyguard. He is on your side. He will fight for you, he or she. But at the same time, you don't want to go, I'm out, and that's a bad look for the innocent people who were waiting in line. But sometimes it's painful. You got to get off set fast. But rather than retaliate or show anger, you leave immediately. You do not show anger. So if I had to choose a favorite fur character to work alongside as a face character, I would honestly say Ratcliffe, because I just found him very amusing. Just the little snobberies that he would do. He acted very like pompous and regal, and with his cape, I remember him flaunting his cape, but he was very scary to the little kids. So never mind him. But more often than anyone, I worked with Genie, honestly. And so I really, he is probably gonna hold the special place in my heart as far as favorite. And I never met a Genie performer that I didn't love and enjoy and genuinely get along with backstage. They were usually really cool people and very hysterical and funny. And so the Aladdin, the Genie, and I would just laugh a lot. So Whereas I felt like some of the face characters sometimes could be high-strung. Fur characters could bring the cool factor or the chill or bring things down to earth, if you will. And I really appreciated like keeping it real, you know what I'm saying? So I appreciated that. But if you were a Disney performer, which role would you rather play? Would you rather be a face character where you're constantly having to talk to guests and use your voice incessantly and be concerned about your physical appearance? Or would you rather be a fur character where you could just entertain people and not worry about some of the more superficial things? Where would you have more fun? Let's talk about it in the comments below. So if you want to hear more about the not so glamorous side of being a face character, definitely check out my video, Why Disney Fired the Evil Queen. It gets into some of the technicalities of being a face character in today's digital age. And don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss the next deep dive. Talk to you guys later. Bye.